Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Decoding the Unknown. Today, John Zegras, the impossible man from a country that did not exist. Isn't this the guy showed up in Japan and he had some is this the man from Taured? I feel like this has been covered many times on YouTube. I've watched it. I've probably made a video about this. Maybe it's a different dude. I don't remember the name John Zegras, but I do remember this happening. I think he shows up in Japan. Anyway, the format of the show, if you're new here, Danny has written me a script. I'm going to read it. If you're wondering why my background's different, behind this wall is an enormous amount of mess. Normally you see my studio, but a new set is being built and all of the stuff from that set is now behind this set. So that's what's going on. It looks neat and tidy, doesn't it? With that, with this fake wall here. Don't fall over. It's really messy. People on the podcast listening to this are like, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? This goes out on YouTube as well. Let's jump into it. When the businessman John Zegras landed in Tokyo Airport, Japan, yes, in 1954, his arrival and subsequent exit sparked a mystery that rumbled on for decades. And it was firmly believed by many that the mysterious Mr. Zegras must have arrived from a place that was considerably further away than anyone could have imagined. But was he a super spy, a time traveler, an alien, or as the most popular theory of all would have us believe, a man from an alternative dimension who had accidentally fallen through a crack in the multiverse? I'll tell you what, he could be a super spy, but he's not a time traveler, an alien, or from another dimension, because as far as we know, those things are impossible.
Well, first of all, through God, all things are possible, so jot that down.
I don't think he was a super spy either, if I remember this story correctly. I think he just had some, the Japanese couldn't read his passport or something. Didn't he come from, Andorra or some shit like that? Or one of those tiny European countries. This story of a man from a country that never existed might already sound like a particularly loopy slice of folklore with zero basis in reality. But hold your interdimensional unicorns for a minute. Well, my daughter would get very excited that I mentioned unicorns in a video today. The unicorn obsession continues. While some of the finer details may have become distorted and embellished over the years, very recent detective work from dedicated internet sleuths has revealed that the curious tale of John Zegras is very much based on an intriguing true story about a mystery man based in a fictional land who was most certainly not who he claimed to be. Oh, okay, maybe there's something new since I last learned about this. High play, which we'd be surprised since 1954. Although mysteries get solved, like the Celebrity 6 one on the shower curtain, that was solved. The tape, the mysterious tape with that band song on, that got solved. Maybe we finally solved Zegrus. Your personal data is everywhere, and you probably don't even realize it, do you? Look, when big companies get hacked, recently it was that BT Group one, where it was a ransomware attack, right? And they stole all of that data. And, well, that data then probably gets sold or misused, and often it's getting sold to data broker sites. Data broker sites, they really suck. They're kind of the reason that you get so much spam. They're the reason you get those calls. It's just like opening yourself up to identity theft and scamming and all of that kind of shady shit that happens on the internet. But that's where Incogni comes in. Of course, they're the sponsor of today's episode, and they automate the process of getting your personal info removed from these shady data broker sites. It saves you time, it saves you effort, it keeps you protected. I mean, you might just be like, oh, yeah, no, I'm not going to bother. But this is just one of those things where it's be like, oh wow, life became easier and nicer when I'm not constantly getting spammed the shit out of all the time and people aren't trying to steal my identity and all that nonsense. That's what Incogni's about. Take your personal data back with Incogni. Use the code unknown at incogni.com/unknown for 60% off an annual plan. That's quite the deal. Thank you, Incogni. And now back to today's episode. John Zegras didn't look like the kind of bloke who would have expected any kind of trouble in getting through the airport immigration queue, at least not in the most widely shared version of the story, which had been frequently recounted across the internet over the last 13 years. Zegras was a smartly dressed and apparently well-travelled Caucasian gentleman, rocking an expensive suit and a slightly grey beard. He gave off the air of a stylish and well-spoken professional who probably owned a trouser press, a personalised cigarette case, and a subscription to the Financial Times. A personalized cigarette case, kind of dope. No, I don't smoke. Yeah, but I would if it wasn't horrible for you. And if I did smoke, I would absolutely have a personalized cigarette case, like one of those nice silver ones that you kind of flip open and take a cigarette out of and maybe has the lighter built into the bottom. Ah, the dream. And I think I do have a subscription to the Financial Times. Also, I think my company might. He wasn't really emitting any strong warning signals that he was exactly the kind of guy who needed to be stopped and searched immediately. in case he was smuggling thousands of dollars of cocaine in his bottom. Not that this would have been a major problem in Tokyo Airport in 1954 anyway, as security was pretty slack back in the old days when nobody was too worried about smuggling, hijackings, or terrorism. Yeah, it's such an alien idea now. Like, that back in the day, getting on a plane used to be like getting on a bus. You're like, welcome on board. Oh, now terrorism has ruined that for everyone, haven't they? Worst. It's the worst. I was going to say it's the worst thing that terrorists have done, but obviously that would be an insane statement. Passengers were trusted to just make their way to the gate without trying to blow anything up, whilst passport and ticket checks were very quick and basic. As long as your picture on the passport vaguely resembled the face of a human, you were usually good to go. So it's not immediately clear why the passport of John Zegras was given such close scrutiny when he arrived at Haneda Airport in Ota City in Tokyo on a blisteringly hot day in July 1954. Perhaps this particular passport clerk just took pride in his job. Oh, it was the 50s. Did they have air conditioning inside in the 1950s? Did they have air conditioning in Mad Men? I think so, right? Or at least it was becoming a thing. But that was the 60s. So probably not, right? That's going to be extremely unpleasant. I recently went to Morocco and I had to stand. I just arrived and just going to the passport hall and it was just rammed. I'm not joking. I stood in the goddamn queue for 3 hours. It was hot and uncomfortable. Perhaps this particular passport clerk just took pride in his job, or perhaps he just enjoyed trying to guess the nationality of every passenger that he waved through. Yeah, dude, I would be exactly the same way. Like, if I had this job, I'd come up with games, and I'd just be like, just playing games all day, being like, Spain. And they'd be like, Spain, yes! And the immigration officer next to me would be like, what the Whistler? He would have had a hard time correctly guessing the nationality of John Zegras, though. The passport itself looked perfectly genuine. There was just a minor quibble with one of the details. According to the passport, John Zegras hailed from a country called Taured, and the problem here is that the country of Taured does not exist, at least not in our version of reality. The passport clerk reportedly popped off to check with a few of his colleagues, as I guess it wasn't out of the question that he might not have been familiar with the country. I don't think you need a PhD in geography to get a job as a passport clerk. If someone told me that they were born in a country called St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I might have initially assumed that they were mixing up real countries with the names of 1970s glam rock bands. Up until today, I had no idea that this was a genuine country in the Eastern Caribbean. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of these, like, tiny little countries that you're like, there's 180 countries in the world. And you're just like, oh, there's so many. I wonder how many countries I could name. I bet I could name, like, 50, which is barely a quarter. However, none of the clerk's colleagues had heard of Taured either, and sensing that something fishy was going down here, John Zegras was politely asked to step out of the queue and take a seat in the customs interrogation room so that this puzzling matter could be quickly cleared up with immigration officers. Zegras seemed quite bemused by the whole thing at first, and probably just assumed that everyone who worked here was a fool. He claimed to have never experienced a problem like this before in his extensive travels around the globe, which were clearly documented with authentic passport stamps. He explained that this was the third time this year alone that he'd visited Japan, but this was the first time that had ever been questioned over his roots. Zegras was happy to hand over several other personal possessions for inspection, including a wallet stuffed with currencies from different European countries. Why? Why wouldn't you leave those at home? You're going to Japan. Your random European currency isn't going to be very useful. He showed off his driver's license issued by the country of Taured and a checkbook issued by a bank in Taured, both of which looked completely legit aside from the minor indiscrepancies with the country not appearing on any known map of Earth. He also furnished the officials with details of the genuine hotel in Tokyo where he was booked to stay and the genuine company at which he worked. The whole reason for his business trip was to keep an important appointment with the Tokyo division. And here's the funny thing about John Zegras. He certainly wasn't coming across as a deluded soul or a silly prankster. You don't want to do this sort of prank. Like, that'd be a lesson, YouTube people. Don't make a fake passport and go traveling, all right? You're going to end up in prison. During the initial conversations, he kept himself calm and collected, coming across as a serious and intellectual business professional who was now just a bit baffled after hitting a completely unexpected problem. He was also cooperating with officials in any way that he possibly could, as he seemed keen to get this misunderstanding dealt with as quickly as possible so that he could check into his hotel and set up that trouser press. My wife and I have an ongoing joke whenever we travel, and it's like, oh yeah, they were, you go through passport control or whatever, and anytime there's any sort of delay, I always just say to my wife, remember, if they make you step aside or whatever, just tell them that you're an international businesswoman on international business. Because we both liked How I Met Your Mother, and that was one of the funniest scenes that I've ever seen.
We are international businessmen on a very important international business trip. I demand you release us immediately.
We are international businessmen.
We are international businessmen. My colleague accidentally left the bags there. Now please let us go before we miss our international business meeting.
However, the atmosphere did eventually grow a little tense when it became apparent that John Zegras and the officials were just going around in circles by taking it in turns to argue about whether or not Taured was a real country, as the interview descended into a pantomime chorus of, "Oh yes it is," and "Oh no it isn't." Eventually, one of the officials came up with a bright idea of pulling out a map and getting Zegrus to point at his fictional country. Quick as a flash, Zegrus stretches out his finger to indicate the exact location of his motherland, but then his face falls. His eyes begin to dart around the room with a mixture of suspicion and genuine bewilderment and fear. The place that he's pointing to is the Principality of Andora. There we go! The 6th smallest state in Europe, sandwiched, but 6th smallest? Andorra's tiny! What are the other small ones? I know there's Monaco, Liechtenstein, Vatican City, Andorra. I guess there's some other island ones. There's some islands, maybe? That kind of thing? Maybe? Isle of Man's not a separate country. No, that's UK. Oh, I don't know. I'm not going to get them. Today, it's notable for being a contender for the home to the most scenic branch of McDonald's in the world, offering views of the Pyrenees Mountains as you nosebag your French fries. The country is also notable for not having an army, a railway station, or an airport, which might have made life quite difficult for a frequent flyer like John Zegras, who would have had to make his own way to either France or Spain before hopping on a plane. Probably not that much of a hassle. Like, I live in Prague. Vienna Airport is the nearest airport in another country, and it's like, 3.5 hours drive? Something like that? 4 hours? Not ideal, but not the worst thing in the world. But that's all academic anyway, as Zegrus had never heard of the Principality of Andorra, and he was now becoming, what language are they talking? What language does he speak? To the Japanese people, I assume they must converse in English, right? Common language. And he was now becoming quite troubled and irate over what exactly was going on here, and why his home country had been replaced on what he presumed was a fake map. Everything else about the map was deemed to be perfectly accurate, it's just that some scoundrels had replaced Taured with Andorra. Tempers were now boiling over as Zegrus accused the officials of playing weird mind games with him. He insisted that Taured had been around for over 1,000 years, and he was now demanding to see government officials, preferably the type who knew how to read a real map. If I remember rightly, he's from Andorra, right? And there was something like the Japanese misread his passport or some such, and they'd never seen an Andorran passport before because it's such a tiny place. For their part, the officials were becoming just as confused as Zegrus, this traveller from nowhere whose primary language appeared to be French, but he was also fluent in 13 other languages, including Japanese. Holy shit. Seemed to be perfectly respectable and an honest guy who was becoming increasingly flummoxed by how his day was panning out. 13 languages, god damn. I'm impressed when someone's like, I speak like 3 languages. I'm like, shh, that's impressive. This guy's like, I got 10 on that. Initially unsure of how to move forward on this, it was eventually decided that there were sufficient grounds to detain John Zegras on suspicion of traveling with a fake passport, and perhaps a hell of a lot more than that once the immigration officials had gotten to the bottom of this. His possessions were confiscated and held in a secure location, as Zegras was taken to a hotel room for the night with 2 guards posted on the locked door at all times. Despite his ordeal, Zegras had calmed down a bit by the evening and was still doing his best to offer his full cooperation. Meanwhile, the investigation by the immigration officers was going about as well as they had expected. Whilst the hotel in Tokyo was genuine, the hotel staff confirmed that they'd received no bookings for a Mr. Zegras. Whilst the company at which he claimed to work was real, they had never heard of him, and confirmed that while they did indeed have offices in Tokyo, they didn't currently have a presence in a country that did not exist. It was also impossible to get a hold of the bank that issued his checkbook, as nobody from Taured appeared in any phone book. The next morning, the guards were instructed to check on the visitor and inform him that he was invited to participate in another discussion with officials to ascertain exactly what he was playing at. The hotel room was on the very top floor of the building and had no balcony. There had always been 2 guards positioned outside the door, and Zegrus had not left the room all night. Oh yeah, he vanishes, doesn't he? So it's a little surprising when guards opened the hotel room to find it completely empty. If that wasn't strange enough, it was later discovered that his possessions, locked away in an entirely separate location, had also vanished into thin air. Despite sweeping searches and exhaustive inquiries, the man from Taured was never seen again in this dimension. So, Just who, in all of time and space, was he meant to be? And where did he really come from? The man who wasn't there. Theories abound that John Zegras was either mentally ill or a comedy prankster with way too much time on his hands, but neither of those seem to fit with the description of the man's character or help explain his vanishing from this realm. Perhaps he was some kind of seasoned spy who would have barely broken a sweat at the thought of escaping from a locked top-floor hotel room. Yeah, but if you're a super spy, you don't have like some passport that no one's ever heard of. You have like a super generic passport. You're just like, I don't know, French. You're just like, he speaks French, right? Just have a French passport. No one's going to question a French passport. It's just a French passport. The whole escape from a locked room scenario is often played out in fictional thrillers, but the most compelling examples don't usually involve any kind of window. Whilst it's true that there was no balcony and it was presumably a long way down from the top floor, the window still seems like the most likely exit strategy for a veteran super spy with years of experience under his utility belt. So he's on the top floor, right? So he can maybe get up to the roof? Perhaps he just roped in a mate with a pair of ladders or offered $5 to a passing window cleaner. Mind you, he would have needed to be a pretty amazing spy to have then somehow retrieved his seized possessions after tracking down and breaking into that separate secure location with a rubber chicken crowbar before dashing back home to report to his superiors that Mission Tokyo had got a bit tits up. They'd be like, I told you should have just given me a French passport, you idiots! And this brings up a glaring contradiction. What kind of accomplished spy would be carrying expertly crafted documentation that looked utterly authentic down to the last detail, but then decide to adorn it with the name of a country that didn't exist exactly? I mean, it's not very clever, is it? Surely you're just asking for your whole cover to be blown the next time you happen to bump into a passport clerk who bothers to take a quick look at what you're presenting. Yes, airport security was a lot more casual back in those days, but you still might as well just crayon the words, "Well, dodgy geezer, please arrest me," over your meticulously faked passport. You can buy passports that are for countries that don't exist. They're called there's a name for this. I think I was considering making a video about it at some point, but it was too boring. There was nothing more to it. But you can just buy these passports for countries that once existed and don't exist anymore as novelty items for some reason. I'm not sure what the purpose of that is, but seems kind of fun, I guess. I suppose he could have just been an alien spy working for an intergalactic empire, which was pretty good at forging primitive documents, but overlooked an important detail which was clumsily lost in translation, prompting a brisk teleportation recall of Agent Zegrus and all his personal belongings, right? Because the aliens with the teleportation technology really need to go and spy on Japan. Makes perfect sense. But I fear we're getting a bit silly now. I'm not convinced that he was any kind of spy, human or otherwise. And this makes his daring top-floor escape and the disappearance of his seized items a little harder to explain if he was just a fairly ordinary guy, not used to dangling precariously out of hotel windows and breaking into super-secret facilities. My immediate assumption is that the two things are unrelated. He escaped from the hotel room and they lost his belongings. I think they're just more likely to have lost them or someone nicked them or something like that. Two separate things. For a long while, the two most popular theories doing the rounds were thankfully a lot more grounded in reality, although not necessarily our own reality. They suggested that John Zegras was either a lost time traveler from the future. Wait, how is this grounded in reality? In which the Principality of Andora had been replaced by Taured, or they'd unwittingly arrived from and subsequently returned to a parallel Earth, which was almost identical to our own, aside from the name of the place, nestled in between France and Spain, with a cool branch of McDonald's. This is nonsense. We're now, 70 years in the future, 71 years in the future from when this happened, and Andora is still called Andora. It's not called Taured. And if this guy came from the future from now, it's 2025 and beyond, he's absolutely going to be whoa, what's with all the 1950s technology in Japan? This is stupid. What? He wouldn't be the first man to have reportedly fallen through fractures in reality or cracks in the corridors of time. One story, wheeled out in recent years, involves an incident in 2006 in which a bloke from the past found himself alone and confused in Kiev, Ukraine. The guy's name was Sergei Ponomarenko, not to be confused with the Russian Olympic medal-winning competitive ice skater with the same name, who I'm sure Simon was just about to bring up. All right, of course, Ponomarenko. I'm a big fan of, what was his sport? Ice dancing, yes, sure. Sergei was found wandering around the streets of Kiev asking for directions as he didn't appear to recognize any of the scenery that was there yesterday. The 25-year-old guy was dressed in vintage clothing, clutching an antique camera, and seemed to be under the impression that it was the 1950s. For some reason, he was arrested by police officers and taken in for questioning, although I find it weird that claiming to be from the 1950s was a detainable offense in Kiev. Well, he probably did something, didn't he? Sergei claimed that just moments before it popped up out of nowhere, the year had been 1958. He was carrying what appeared to be authentic Soviet documents from the era, whilst his camera was a Yashica model, which was all the rage back in the 1950s, but practically unheard of in 2006. Alright, well, he's just cosplaying, isn't he? The story grew more peculiar when police decided to develop the film in the antique camera and came across a bunch of photographs depicting Sergei dressed in his current clothing, posing beside his young wife against a backdrop of 1950s Kiev. Alright, so he took some photos on his camera that made it look like the past. I could absolutely do that. It's not that complicated. I could just go fill up my phone with pictures that made it look like the 1950s just by careful shot choice. She presumably had made the trip into the future, as Sergei claimed that the photo had been taken very shortly before his time jump. But then the story goes proper batsh crazy when the police found that a man matching Sergei's appearance was indeed reported missing in 1958. I mean, that's interesting, but Sergei just found that person, he just chose someone who went missing, who looks vaguely like him, back in 1958 and decided to assume that man's identity for the purposes of what I assume is a prank? And would you believe it? They even managed to track down an elderly version of the woman in the photograph who claimed to be her late husband and did go missing for a couple of years, but came back with photographs depicting a futuristic-looking Kiev in the year 2050. I mean, it's interesting, but it's clearly a prank, right? Back in the 2006 time zone, Sergei Ponomarenko had been admitted to hospital for psychiatric assessment. Yeah, it's not a prank, he's mentally unwell. But I think he's not mentally unwell because he has all of this accoutrements, like the camera with the pictures and the documentation and the story. He's thought about this. What we're not going to consider is the fact that he's actually a time traveler, because that would be ridiculous. But he disappeared while going for a wander around the gardens. The security cameras captured footage of him walking out of frame, but there was no sign of him actually leaving the premises. Sergei Ponomarenko was never seen again, although if we wait long enough, we might see him knocking around again in 2050 on the next leg of his wacky time trip. Entirely possible, because maybe someone will like to continue this prank who looks vaguely like him in the year 2050. It all sounds quite similar to a much older story involving a guy called Rudolph Fentz, who appeared out of nowhere in the middle of Times Square in New York in 1951, dressed in 19th century clothing and rocking awesome sideburns. I've heard of this one. He looked a little bewildered by his situation, but didn't have too much time to chew it over, as the poor guy was promptly mowed down and killed by a big yellow taxi. The police later rifled through his pockets and found crisp vintage banknotes and a bunch of freshly penned letters dating back to 1876, along with a collection of old business cards, which revealed the victim's identity. However, the police weren't able to inform his next of kin, as the address on the business cards belonged to a guy who had never heard of Rudolph, while there was no trace that Rudolph ever existed, or at least not until the police dug much deeper into the case and found a man called Rudolph Fentz who had vanished without a trace in 1876. Do you think this guy was trying to pull a prank and then he actually got hit by a car and died? Because I can't imagine he's pulling the prank where the idea is that he gets hit by a car and dies. He's just pulling this prank and this accidentally happens, and it starts this big mystery. Times Square was more likely to have been heaving with horses and carriages in those days, and Rudolph was tragically unprepared for the instant upgrade to taxis. Whilst we scratch our heads over what might really be going on in these cases, we should recognize that there are some significant differences in the case of John Zegras. Yes, they all appear to arrive in a place where they didn't quite belong, and Rudolph made a similar baffling exit. But whereas Sergei Ponomarenko and Rudolph Fentz both came from a different time period, John Zegras appeared to have come from a different reality. There was never really any suggestion from his clothing or behavior or documentation that he was a man displaced from his own era, but some felt it was more likely that he was a man accidentally displaced from his own universe, and who was eventually pulled back into his own dimension at some point from that hotel room. It does seem a bit strange that our parallel world seemed entirely identical, aside from the anomaly with Andora and Taured. I mean, sort of, but if you believe in this multiple universes thing, then there's an infinite number, basically. Every decision ever made leads to new universes and such, so sure, there's going to be one where, I don't know, I have hair, and that's going to be the only difference. That's it. The best universe. But maybe that's the only difference that was actually spotted during this relatively brief incident. If Zegrus had hung around for a little while longer, maybe we would have discovered that he came from a version of the world in which the Axis powers won Second World War, bubble wrap had never been invented, and Rotherham Town came 7th on the list of most popular tourist spots in the world. There's an infinite number of parallel universes, Danny, but there's never one where Rotherham comes 7th of the most popular tourist spots in the world, Danny. It's Rotherham. I've never been to Rotherham. I know nothing about Rotherham other than that child grooming scandal. That's where Danny comes from. That's all I know. This might all sound a bit unlikely. I can't see Rotherham getting any higher than 9th in any dimension. But there are quantum cosmologists and quantum field theorists out there who believe that the many worlds interpretation just might have something in it. My favorite thing about the many worlds interpretation is I'm a big fan of the band or the singer, Eels. What's his name? Mark Everett. And his dad was, I'm assuming, Professor Everett? I don't know. But he's the guy who originally came up with many worlds theory. It's like, holy shit, the guy who sang like from the Eels. It's like crazy. No one finds this as interesting as I do. But I'm like, what? It's like two things I find fascinating. The Eels music and many worlds theory. It's an interpretation of quantum mechanics which boils down to the matter of re-evaluating the phenomenon of wave function collapse, in which the superposition or multiplicity of a particle's potential eigenstates within its probabilistic distribution instantaneously decoheres into a single deterministic eigenstate upon measurement. Alright, I know Danny's I kind of vaguely understand this. I mean, I'm not going to claim that I understand very much about this, but this is that like quantum superposition, right? Where you observe the thing and then it collapses into its certain state. Schrodinger's cat, but until you observe it, it's not in either. It's in both states and neither state at the same time, something like that. Every physicist listening is like, Simon, you don't understand this. You just said you did, but you don't. And that's probably true. Look, this is the second script in a row in which I've stumbled foolishly into quantum mechanics, and I'm not even sure how it's happening. Let's try putting it another way. Something like a particle could potentially be in all possible places or states at once, and the spread out possibility of this is described as a wave function. But as soon as that particle is observed or measured, the wave of possibilities collapses to reflect the single outcome of this one reality. However, the many worlds interpretation implies that there is no such thing as wave function collapse. Instead, all the other possibilities of where that particle might have been go on to be physically realized in other non-interacting worlds, theoretically branching off into more alternative realities than our episodes of The Simpsons. Are they still making The Simpsons? I bet they are. Season like 700. If nothing else, it would put a new spin on the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, in which a potentially poisoned cat trapped in a sealed box is considered to be both alive and dead at the same time until the box has been opened to observe the cat's fate, collapsing the wave function into one definite state. According to the many worlds interpretation, the wave function splits off into different realities after the box had been opened, opening up one universe in which the cat is dead, one universe in which the cat is still alive, and one universe in which Schrodinger's cat had launched its own massively successful unboxing channel on YouTube. I mean, yes, I know Danny's being absurd, but that is kind of the idea behind it, that all possible outcomes have been achieved in some universe.
It's a superposition of both states until you open it and collapse the wave function.
Says you.
There's also a lot of drugs in there.
It's certainly a fascinating notion that there might be alternate realities out there in which I'm an award-winning quantum physicist and Simon is a convicted grave robber. I mean, it's possible. Totally possible. Alas, I mean, if you believe in this. Alas, whilst the interpretation has many supporters, there are scientists who have problems with the idea for a whole multiverse of reasons, one of the most significant being that if these alternative worlds can't ever observe or interact with each other, occasional glitches aside, then it's always destined to remain a speculative concept that can never be proven or disproven. Yeah, do I believe in it? I mean, I believe it's maybe possible, but it can't ever be proven or disproven, so I guess no. It is cool though. So the idea of parallel worlds and alternative dimensions is something that we're only likely to see in works of fiction such as Doctor Strange, Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, and Rick and Morty. I've seen none of those. I know I should see that Everything, Everywhere, All at Once because it's very well rated. I don't think I mean, Rick and Morty, I don't watch a lot of cartoons. And Doctor Strange, isn't that in the Marvel Universe? Forget that. Speaking of fiction, that's the exact same realm in which we'll find the true sources of our other two time-hopping friends. A few YouTubers have spent time attempting to debunk the story of Sergei Ponomarenko by pointing out that some of the photographs supposedly depicting a futuristic Kiev in 2050 look suspiciously like they've been photoshopped and one of them appears to have the Empire State Building in the background, alright? In fact, the truth is very simple. The whole story was originally featured on a Ukrainian television show from 2012 entitled Aliens. This is one of those tacky shows which dramatically reconstructs spooky, mysterious events with the aid of actors who weren't considered quite good enough to get the gig on the TV commercial for Rice Krispies.
Let's set the record straight about Kellogg's Rice Krispies.
Okay.
They're not just empty puffs of air.
No way.
Aliens is a particularly poor example, as the show focuses on some quite ridiculous urban legends, whilst a blink-and-you'll-miss-it disclaimer at the beginning reveals that all these stories lack conclusive evidence. So whilst it's kind of presented as a staged reconstruction of a real-life event, it's actually just complete codswallop from start to finish. It's like, yeah, always take based on a true story with a just giant handful of salt, as if you're Gordon Ramsay making popcorn. And if you get that reference, it's an incredibly niche one. As for the story of the 19th century Rudolph Fentz getting struck and killed by a taxi in Times Square, this has regularly been reported as fact, ever since it appeared in a 1953 booklet written by Ralph Holland, who presented it as a genuine case which suggested a glitch in the fourth dimension. Isn't the fourth dimension just time? Oh, okay, so that makes sense. Yeah, because this wasn't a parallel universe one. This was a time one. In fact, Ralph had just stolen the whole idea, names and all, from a fictional story entitled I'm Scared, written by Jack Finney just 1 year earlier. Well, that's a bit mean. You'd think that Ralph would have stopped to consider how some readers may have noticed this blatant theft and redressing of fiction as fact, but to be fair, not everybody did over the next 70 years. So a skeptic might immediately assume that it's a very similar story with the case of John Zegras. The whole thing started out as a completely fictional story which evolved into urban legend as it was later shared and embellished in paranormal encyclopedias and around internet campfires. But that skeptic would be dead wrong. The man who knew too little. For quite some time, it was believed that one of the earliest sources of the story was printed in a 1981 booklet entitled The Directory of Possibilities. Yes, it's one of those silly paranormal encyclopedias, in this case co-edited by a chap called Colin Wilson, who was once described by science writer Martin Gardner as an intelligent writer, but one who had decayed into an occult eccentric writing books for the lunatic fringe. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this all the time, but it's like, if you can't sell your fiction, just label it as fact. It wasn't Colin Wilson who wrote the entry on the man from Taured, though. That would be a writer named Paul Begg, who had previously written a book entitled Into Thin Air, People Who Disappear, in 1979. According to the further reading section of the Directory of Possibilities, Paul Begg was meant to be writing a sequel to his earlier work entitled Out of Thin Air, People Who Appear From Nowhere, but funnily enough, the book never appeared on the shelves. And that's a shame, as the proposed sequel sounded like it may have expanded on the single sentence on Taured that appeared in the Directory of Possibilities. Quoting here, in 1954, a passport check in Japan is alleged to have produced a man with papers issued by the nation of Taured. And that's all we got. Later in 1999, the story was expanded into a whole paragraph in the book Strange But True, Mysterious and Bizarre People, written by Tom Slemen. But he didn't really provide much in the way of detail, other than to note that the still unnamed traveller from Taured left Japan of his own accord and presumably somehow went back home. It wasn't until 2012 that we begin to see the full version of the story in an article written by Terence Aim, posted on the Before It's News website, and it's here that the traveller first appeared to acquire his name. And it's from this article that online paranormal buffs were first introduced to the details involving his documentation, the link with the Principality of Andora, and the final escape from a locked top-floor hotel room. Terence Aim explained that his sources for the story had been pulled from several books about the weird and strange published during the 1950s, but he doesn't care to name them. This is not sounding very promising so far, is it? We might assume that Terence Aim just took the basic idea from the earlier books and fleshed it out quite a bit. That's exactly what I'm assuming. He's got to provide some... I mean, he doesn't, because it's probably just nonsense, but it would be nice if he provided some sort of primary source. But whilst we're not quite sure what books Terence was using as his source material, I suppose he may have hired his reference books from a library in another dimension. It seems that maybe his sources were a hell of a lot more credible than we may have guessed. And here's a funny thing about the mystery man from Taured. Even today, it's often described in the very latest online articles as a baffling mystery that was never conclusively solved. Ooh, is it conclusively solved? That's nice. I like it when we conclusively solve something. And then I'm like, the answer's really boring. It's like when you see a magician. Did you guys watch that Masked Magician show when you were kids? when or whenever, where it's like it shows you how the magicians do their like big elaborate tricks, and then you learn and you're like, oh, that's really disappointing every time.
When the magician picks up the hat, he also picks up the rabbit and puts it inside. Take another look in slow motion. The hat goes up, and in goes the rabbit.
During my research, I came across a whole stack of fresh online investigations, many of them from 2024, which still seemed convinced that the story had no real conclusion and was probably just a myth originally plucked from the pestilent pages of paranormal prattle. And that's very odd, or perhaps just very lazy, because this case was quite exhaustively solved between 2017 and 2021 thanks to the quite incredible work of a group of researchers and internet detectives who managed to put just about all of the pieces together. Holy shit, okay. The honorable list of cyber sleuths include Redditors Nathaniel Antonioli, Tariochi Naokari, along with writer Julia Lewis, who put together a comprehensive piece for the Fortean Times in 2021. Between them, this group of digital diggers managed to uncover a wealth of contemporary Japanese newspaper reports and radio broadcasts which confirmed that much of the story is completely true. There was indeed a man. So why didn't the original guy who wrote about it share his sources? If that's because he came up with previously you could say, oh, he came up with the name. But then he didn't. It was real. Why not say where you got the name from? It would add a whole lot of legitimacy. There was indeed a man who arrived in Haneda Airport in Tokyo in the 1950s under the name of John Zegras, with connections to a country that did not exist. It's just that some of the details got a little distorted along the way, and not in a manner that you'd typically expect. In fact, the seeds of the confusion were somewhat surprisingly sown about 6,000 miles, or well over 9,000 kilometers away from the airport, in the Houses of Parliament in Westminster, London. What? But before we drop in on the UK debate that accidentally changed the flight path of the story, let's look at what really happens when the man from nowhere touched down in Tokyo. Wait, what does London have to do with any of this? John Zegras didn't look like the type of bloke who would have expected any trouble in getting past the immigration queue. John Allen Kuchar Zegrus was a smartly dressed and apparently well-traveled Caucasian gentleman rocking an expensive suit and a slightly grey beard. And yes, I bet he owned a trouser press. But there are several deviations right at the beginning of this true journey. For starters, he landed at Haneda Airport a few years later than we originally thought, in October 1959. He was 36 rather than 25, and he wasn't traveling alone. He was accompanied by his unnamed 30-year-old common-law wife from South Korea, and it was established that they'd traveled from Taipei in Taiwan. But the biggest deviation from the most widely shared story is that despite Zegras having a somewhat dubious passport, he managed to breeze through immigration with no problem at all, and spent the next 3 months enjoying life in Tokyo with his partner until he was arrested by Tokyo Metropolitan Police on suspicion of attempted bank fraud. Zegras had been caught attempting to cash checks totaling 300,000 yen at the Tokyo branch of Chase Manhattan Bank, and another $140 traveler's check at a branch of the Bank of Korea, adding up to a very rough estimated total somewhere in the region of $10,000 in today's money. The problem for Zegras was that in sharp contrast to the personnel at Haneda Airport, the staff at both banks had gone to the trouble of taking a good look at the passport that Zegras was using as proof of identity. Yeah, because these guys have something to lose. Whereas the airport guys are just like, welcome to Japan. Whereas we were originally led to believe that the passport looked impressively authentic, it transpires that it actually looked like it was knocked up as part of a school project by kids who'd never seen one in real life. It came plastered with messily forged stamps which were supposed to represent Japanese embassies, and it was covered in strange text that resembled something you might find engraved on the walls of ancient temples, but was later dismissed by linguistic specialists as an entirely made-up language. It was widely reported that the passport was instantly recognizable as fake on very first glance. One Japanese newspaper even reported that it was the size of a weekly magazine. Dude, you didn't even get the size right. Maybe passports were bigger in the past, though. Actually, I don't think so. I've seen pictures of old passports and stuff, and you see old passports in museums and stuff. They were always kind of the same size. Just all countries have exactly the same size passport. Did we all agree on just making them, it must be A6? Maybe? Oh, that's not going to mean anything to Americans. A quarter of the size of this. Right? Yeah, look. There we go. That's about the size of a passport. For audio listeners, maybe a little. No, that's about the right size, I think. That's about the right size. Probably is A6. It's A4 is I think you call it a legal size, a legal letter, the standard size of paper that your printer will use. And then we come to his job title and the name of the country that he was supposed to represent. No, it wasn't Taured. Zegrus reckons that he was a roving ambassador for a country by the name of Negusi-Habesi, which does share some similarities with Taured in that it doesn't exist either. And all of this returns us to the question of why anyone would go to the trouble of forging a passport containing an invented country in an invented language. Maybe Zegrus was hoping that the bank teller would just shrug and assume that he was dealing with a particularly exotic foreigner from a deeply obscure part of the world, a place where passports were the size of weekly magazines. The investigation was handed over to a guy called Atsuyuki Sasa, who would eventually go on to become the first Director General of the Cabinet Security Affairs Office in Japan in the 1980s. But back in 1960, when John Zegras was arrested, Sasa was working for Foreign Affairs Division of the Public Security Bureau within the Metropolitan Police Department. And in what proved to be another recent big boost into coding the unknown, Atsuyuki Sasa published his memoirs in 2016 entitled The Spies Who Passed Me By. That's a great title for a book, written by someone who does this. Whilst the book is only available in the Japanese language and not likely to be found in any library outside the land of the rising sun, the army of keyboard gumshoes were on the case again when it came to sourcing an English translation of the chapter dealing with the conversations between Atsuyuki Sasa and John Zegras. I wonder if you could just ask ChatGPT what's in the book nowadays. Do you think it's absorbed that? And this, along with all those translated Japanese press reports and news broadcasts, has played an instrumental part in helping to unravel the whole puzzle. Zegras, who apparently really was fluent in 14 languages, not even 13, holy shit, certainly had a lot to say for himself, and he appeared to have led a pretty eventful life. He never claimed to have been born in Negusi-Habesi. In fact, he reckoned he was born in the US before moving through Europe and ending up serving as a fighter pilot for the Royal Air Force during the Second World War, although he was shot down early and spent most of the war in a German POW camp. After the war, he moved to South America and was later recruited to work as an American spy in Korea. He was soon taken to the skies again as a pilot in Vietnam before eventually signing up with the United Arab Republic to carry out secret missions on behalf of the mysterious nation of Negusi-Habesi. Somewhere in all that mix, he also managed to find the time to work for the FBI and the CIA, with whom he still held strong connections. I mean, it does kind of sound like bullshit, doesn't it? It's like, what's that subreddit where it's like, yeah, that really happens or whatever? And then everybody clapped. Although it's not mentioned in the book by Atsuyuki Sasa, I'd like to think that John Zegras was also a highly acclaimed school milk monitor and recipient of the Buttsville Paperboy of the Year trophy over 3 consecutive campaigns. He seemed quite annoyed about this turn of events in Tokyo. He claimed that the reason for his visit was to carry out a top-secret mission recruiting new Japanese volunteers for the Great Arab Coalition, and that his arrest was a violation of diplomatic privileges. Bruh, your passport's the size of a magazine. You don't have any diplomatic privileges. It's all made up. In a scene that mirrored the earlier version of the story, Zegrus was indeed invited to point out the location of Negusi-Habesi on a world map, but the outcome wasn't quite so dramatic. He just kind of vaguely pointed south of Ethiopia and didn't make too much of a fuss that Negusi-Habesi wasn't there, and probably turned the conversation back to how he once escaped being boiled alive in a pot by a tribe of cannibals in the region of Munchalicious. Of course, just about every detail of his story appeared to be complete bollocks, at least in 14 different languages. While Sasa and his colleagues at the Foreign Affairs Division did their best to follow up on every tiny detail, it was blindingly obvious that the whole life story of John Zegras was a weekly magazine-sized tissue of lies, and sadly, the Kingdom of Negusi-Habesi never returned the phone calls. Oh no, what a surprise! His common law wife was deported back to South Korea, whilst what is a common law? What is a common law wife? Is that like your wife but just by default? How does that even work? While Zegras faced trial at Tokyo District Court on charges related to attempted bank fraud, identity fraud, and illegal entry into the country. Although he was found guilty, the original sentencing was interrupted when Zegras suddenly produced a glass shard that had somehow smuggled into the courtroom, declared that he was going to kill himself, and began slashing his own arms. It sounded like an attempt to stall proceedings, rather than to take his own life, and following a trip to hospital, he was eventually sentenced to a year in prison. During his stay, he kept busy by attempting to file a civil lawsuit against the Superintendent General seeking $1 million for alleged embezzlement, but that quietly fizzled out. Yeah, dude, you're the one who's in prison for fraud, not this dude. After he was released, several Japanese newspapers reported that he was deported to Hong Kong, as this was apparently the last place he was known to legally enter. This is a little surprising, as his real name and nationality were never identified. Some of the newspapers had even dropped the name John Zegras from their reports of the court case, preferring to label the defendant as a mysterious foreigner of unknown nationality and background. Whilst he claimed to have been born in the US, he claimed a lot of things that were proven to be false. They'd be like, hey, America, it's Japan. We're sending this dude home. America just be like, bro, he ain't ours. We're not taking him. He's not ours. And this is a little weird, as deportation usually requires a verified nationality before it can legally go ahead. We can only assume that Hong Kong was happy to cut through the red tape and help out Japan with this one. Perhaps they were just keen to recruit John Zegras to the Royal Hong Kong Police Force Special Branch. Or, I don't know, maybe he'd be a fighter pilot, a super spy. He worked for the CIA and FBI. And of course, all of this does leave us with something of a mystery. We never discovered the real name and nationality of John Zegras. We never found out his real backstory, and we never found out what he did next. What we do know is that the true account of his time in Tokyo contains no hint of him being an interdimensional traveler at all, and is a much simpler tale of a slightly rubbish fraudster and yarn spinner. So, how on earth did we get from a clumsy criminal who claimed to be working for Negusi Habesi to a man from Taured who vanished without a trace from a locked hotel room and returned to his own version of reality? Well, I blame the bloody British government for this one. Oh yeah, we got to get back to London. What's going on? The wrong man. On July the 20th, 1960, Robert Matthews, the backbencher Conservative MP for Honiton, had a bee in his bonnet about passports which he felt were not particularly effective security checks. He's kind of right though, isn't he? During a debate in the House of Commons, he brought up the very recent case of John Zegras to help illustrate the point that passports are about as useful as a leaky bucket in the desert. But his long, rambling speech included some deeply puzzling references which appeared to have been plucked from nowhere. He declared that Zegras had claimed to be a naturalized Ethiopian, which is not currently documented and may well have been inspired by the fact that he once briefly pointed to south of Ethiopia on a world map. Ron Matthews also reckoned that Zegras had been travelling around the world and passport looked incredibly authentic aside from the bits that were written in a fictional language, which is not true at all, as the passport was easily identified as a fake by anyone who actually bothered to look at it. But Matthews also told the House of Commons that the passport was stated to have been issued in the fictional city of Tamanrosset, which is the capital city of a fictional state of Taured. It's not quite Taured, but we're certainly getting there. Now, this is wrong on several counts, not just because the fake passport stated no such thing, but also because Tamanrosset appears to be a mispronunciation of Tamanrasset, which is not a fictional city, but a very real province in the southern region of Algeria. As for Taured, this might not be the name of a place, but it does appear to be a mispronunciation of Tuareg, which is the name of a nomadic society who you're quite likely to find mooching around Tamanrasset. Isn't it also the name of a VW? Is there a VW Touareg? Is that the big 4x4? Is that what it's called? I think it's the most popular SUV in Europe. The VW Touareg. I could be completely wrong on that, but it does feel like the name of a VW. So now we have to ask ourselves what exactly Robert Matthews was pissing about at here. I mean, maybe he was from an alternate dimension. Why not? I mean, it's not like a Conservative MP to just stand up and tell a load of blatant porkies in the House of Commons. Well, in this instance at least, it probably wasn't a case of a Conservative MP deliberately trying to mislead Parliament. We can't say for sure why his speech was littered with so many inaccuracies. He was probably just getting his information from translated Japanese news broadcasts, and perhaps he just happened to be tuning into a broadcast which got a lot of stuff garbled in translation, although no evidence exists of such a broadcast today. Yeah, but it was the past. That is a lot of stuff that we just don't have record of. Perhaps one of his aides was having an off day and couldn't quite remember all of the details, so they just pulled out some words from an encyclopedia that appeared to be vaguely connected with Africa. He's like, oh yes, he's a Tuareg. Sure, boss. Whatever the reason, the words of Robert Matthews had a pretty big impact on where the story went next. Just a couple of weeks later, the Canadian newspaper The Province used the speech as basis for their report entitled Man with His Own Country, which marveled at the sheer audacity of a man who had been traveling around the world on a masterfully created fake passport and praised the people of Japan for being the first to consider actually looking at it whilst reaching out for a map. This article also goes to the trouble of correcting the British MP's mispronunciation of Tamanrasset, although the province doesn't seem to be aware that it's a real location, as they also consider it to be the capital of the fictional Taured. The case continued to pop up regularly throughout the 60s and 70s, particularly in books by the French writer, chemical engineer, and spy Jacques Bergier, who had a bit of a reputation for concocting popular myths. We've come across his name in one of the previous DTU episodes on Project Rice. Bergier was the author of a strange book called Morning of the Magicians, in which he runs through a load of ridiculous conspiracy theories as if they were real. Like I say, if you can't get your fiction published, just label it as fact. The point's in the introduction that the whole book is meant to be a test of the reader's cognitive and critical thinking skills. Well, no, a reader with cognitive and critical thinking skills would not have bought the book in the first place. And it was in that book that we saw the first published reference to Die Glocke Project, which was supposedly an anti-gravity machine, hidden away in Project Rice in the Owl Mountains, a conspiracy theory which was to take on a life of its own after the publication of the book. We can hardly hold Jacques Bergier responsible for concocting the false version of the story of John Zegras, but he did add a few elements of his own throughout his various printed musings on the case. For some reason, he decides to change the year from 1959 to 1954, and he largely cuts out the airport sequences as he paints a picture of a man who had been living in Japan for some time before suspicious government officials arrived at his hotel room to check his passport. This is the first time we're introduced to the element of a hotel room in the story, although according to Bergier, John Zegras didn't just disappear into thin air whilst locked in the room. He was instead shut up in a Japanese psychiatric hospital for the rest of his life. Sounds like that's more where he belongs. It's not clear why Jacques Bergier felt compelled to add these new details, but he might just have been having another go at testing the cognitive and critical thinking skills of his readers. It's not an excuse. Is it like if I made an error? Is that, just testing. Just testing. Every time I make a mispronunciation, just testing. And this more or less brings us back to the point that we reached a while ago with the 1981 publication of the Directory of Possibilities, which in just a single sentence introduces us to the place of Taured, a name which stuck for quite some time. We were still referring to the fictional land of Taured by the time we got to the 2012 article on Before It's News website written by Terence Aim, which also includes all the stuff about the connection with the Principality of Andora and the cunning escape from the locked hotel room. I don't think Terence Aim was responsible for making all of that up, though. I suspect he was compiling a bunch of rumors and speculation and outright fabrications that had popped up online in the preceding years, and he mashed them up with slightly more sensible, if occasionally inaccurate, material from the 1960s onwards. There's still something quite odd, and maybe not entirely honest about his sources, though, as whilst he claimed to have pulled the story together from several books about the weird and strange published during the 1950s, we now know that John Zegras wasn't even arrested until 1960. But on the whole, the fictional version of the mystery man from Taured appears to have evolved from the combination of a clueless British MP talking out of his arse, careless clerical errors, clumsy fact-checking, the usual embellishments tacked on in print and online, and perhaps, most importantly of all, a language barrier. As so much of the reliable contemporary text requires a good grasp of the Japanese language, it was perhaps inevitable that the off-beam English versions of the case were always going to get more exposure than the original, accurate Japanese sources. Yeah, because they're more interesting, aren't they? That's the problem. Truth is usually boring. And whilst it might seem a bit of a shame that John Zegras wasn't quite an interdimensional traveller after all, it's still fascinating to come across a story that was widely dismissed for years by killjoy skeptics as a totally fabricated myth, yet turned out to be based on an entirely genuine case. If only we knew more about the life of the real John Zegras, or whatever his name was, and what happened to him after he got deported. It would have been nice if it dropped us all a postcard at some point to let us know I was getting on. Mind you, I'm not sure we'd have ever received it. The postal service in Taured has always been notoriously unreliable. Some say it's worse than the postal service in Prague. I like that joke, Danny. My sagas with the postal service. Anyway, that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for being here. Appreciate you, and I'll see you in the next one.